In the last half hour, this guy's election prank on his brother just became a huge meme. In the last 2 hours, Egypt election considered unlikely to threaten FDI. In the last 4 hours, election authority looking into finding eligible Egyptians who refused vote. Egypt votes in presidential election on final day, with all eyes on turnout in the last 6 hours. In the last 8 hours, Egyptians offered food and money to vote on last day of election. Egyptians abstaining from voting in election to be fined. NEA Acto mocks Egyptian presidential election. Egypt pulls out stops for voter support on last day of Sisi election. Presidential election. The witnesses moderate turnout. Human Rights Council. Egypt election. I'm not going to vote. I know the result. Sisi will win. Earlier today, Egyptian presidential election resumed for third and final day of voting in Egyptian presidential election. Egyptians cast ballots on slow second day in 2018 election. Egypt's farcical election and the long Arab winter. The Trump administration cheers at Egypt's sham election yesterday. What to know about Egypt's presidential election? Woman carries sick husband to vote in Egypt's presidential election. Watch wife carries sick husband to vote in Egypt's presidential election. Egypt election 2018. Sisi's statements contradict the facts on the ground. Grand old dame of 103 casts her vote in Egyptian presidential election. Video. Egyptians rejoice and dance at election polling stations. Banquet and shisha impresses U.S. delegation supervising Egyptian election. Egyptians cast ballots on second day of presidential election. Egypt. Egyptians cast ballot in presidential election. Egypt holds second day of presidential election, but outcome not in doubt. Europe and the Egyptian election do not congratulate Egyptians. Vote in second day of election. Egypt holds second day of presidential election. Egyptians continue voting in controversial presidential election. High turnout of women in first day of Egyptian presidential election. Egypt holds second day of presidential election. Outcome known. Egypt's election. All votes will go to al-Sisi. Election outcome may be assured, but Egyptians demand improvements. In the last 7 days, Sisi supporters revel as Egypt election gets underway. Services for votes. Egypt's government seeks high election turnout as polls open. Election rumors plague Egyptians. Egypt votes in presidential election. Picks. Sisi supporters revel as Egypt election gets underway. Egypt's revolutionaries grieve ahead of Sisi re-election. Egypt 72-hour presidential election. Egypt election expected to give Sisi landslide victory. Egypt election. What has Sisi done since taking power? Sisi's only election pledge is to widen his crackdown. Egypt deploys thousands of troops for election. Sisi supporters revel as Egypt election gets underway. Thousands of soldiers on streets for Egypt's sham election. Egypt's election proceeds amid tight security. Egyptian election. Yes, there is another candidate. Candidates cast vote in Egypt's presidential election. Egypt presidential election kicks off in Cairo. Sisi widely expected to win landslide in Egypt election. Egyptian premier dubs presidential election response to terrorism. An idiot's guide to Egypt's 2018 presidential election. Polls open in Egypt's presidential election as critics call for a boycott. Egypt's election. Air in power. Sisi to win Egyptian election, but seeks high turnout. Egypt's election begins as al-Sisi seeks second term. Was there an election in Egypt? What does this silence mean? Egypt polls open for 3-day presidential election. Egypt's presidential election begins as al-Sisi seeks second term. Egypt's presidential election begins. Egypt election begins with President al-Sisi certain winner. Egypt opens polls for presidential election. The latest polls opened in Egypt's presidential election. Voting begins in Egyptian presidential election. Egyptian voters head to polls for presidential election. Presidential election in Egypt to begin on Monday. Egypt goes to the polls in presidential election. Egyptians vote in presidential election. Egypt to vote in presidential election. Egypt election. Polls open amid concerns over voter apathy. Election in Egypt. Al-Sisi is on the side of the autocratic rulers. Egypt's police 6 terrorists on election eve.